I was very curious about my family's history from the time I was a little kid, and I was profoundly impacted by the movie Roots by Alex Haley, which I know was a book, but I saw it as a very young boy, and my parents were sitting there with me watching the film. And at that point, I had a lot of curiosity, even back then, about my father, who was raised in Jim Crow era Alabama. At that point, I didn't know that Alabama was a state that went through apartheid, where African Americans lived through a form of apartheid. I just knew that my father had a very difficult relationship with Alabama because he would never really speak about it. And so that was the burning question of my childhood, was what happened in Alabama. And when Roots came out, that was the first time that I started to wonder when my family came to America, how my family came to America, and how, if anything, how my modern experience as a little boy um, related to that. Everybody is curious about their relationship to this country. It's a country that I loved from the time I was a young kid. And so there were so many different things that stem from my curiosity as a little boy, the same curiosity that led me to become a journalist, that informed this feeling that I one day hoped that I could study my family history and get the answers to those questions. And then, of course, when all of the DNA testing and family history and genealogy started to become a hobby for a lot of people, I had by then built skills to be an investigative journalist. And I took a test through ancestry.com, and man, that just turned out to be something that helped me start to understand my family. And then once I established that there was a book there, because just because you have family history and that you know about it doesn't mean that a publisher would be interested in publishing the story. So I really had to figure out, what is it about my family story that I can bring to the world so that they can see this piece of the American experience and learn something from. So I wrote it for myself, yes. I also wrote it for my father, because my father was very curious about his history, because previous generations also wouldn't talk about what happened in Alabama to them. So every generation kept secrets from subsequent generations. So I felt like it needed to stop with me, and that we needed to finally get to the end, to the heart of the story. And so I wrote it for my father, for myself, and also for Americans and people all over the world who are interested in American history. And this is not an academic book. This is a book that really digs into the history and tells a very nuanced story about one Black American family's experience. And I thought that that would be of great value to people who may have sat through history classes and learned about slavery and Jim Crow, but had never had anyone go back and actually study how slavery and Jim Crow affected individual members of their family and a family through the generations. Yes, my father indeed was my best friend. And I think the father son dynamic in the Black American family, and families of color, in the immigrant experience in many cases. I'm not all, I don't want to speak on behalf of everyone because everybody has a different experience. I was born in 1971 on the Minot, North Dakota Air Force Base, just 7 years after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. My father was enlisted in the Air Force to serve his country, coming out of Jim Crow apartheid, a system that didn't even recognize him as equal to white people, but he served his country despite that. My parents were very, very determined to give their children the American dream. And part of that, what I didn't understand at the time, was this fixation and hypervigilance about watching over their children and making sure that their children acted like adults, to protect them from the possibility of being killed by the police, by white supremacists, by one of our own, because the homicide crisis in our community is very real. And I saw this hypervigilance in my parents, but at that time when I was growing up, I didn't really know what it was all about. I thought they were just paranoid. And then when I went into the history, I started to understand that yes, my father's grandfather, both of my father's grandfathers were murdered in Alabama. My grandfather was murdered in Alabama. And every generation since 1837, a person has been murdered in my family on either side. And what it's about most of the time is about land and livestock. The fact that we were very entrepreneurial people was something that we had to pay a dear price for. In many cases, both of my grandparents had their fathers killed when they were young. Neither one of those white men who killed them were brought to justice. And so even if they never opened up in depth to my father about what had happened to their fathers, my father knew from this vicariously going through the reality of America and Emmett Till and Alabama and all of the things that he witnessed. He was chased by the Ku Klux Klan as a 16-year-old, and all of those things informed him when he went to Maplewood, Minnesota to raise his son. The idea was we're in this predominantly white community, but I had a father whose mind was very much still back in Alabama, not to mention that it was a time where Black Americans were integrating suburbs all over America. We talk a lot about the Little Rock Nine, but not as much about the thousands of Black children who were going into these schools and oftentimes facing hate speech, being, chased home from school. And when we fought back, sometimes, we were the ones who got in trouble, and then we would have to go home and get whooped by our parents for getting in trouble at school. And so there were all of these very, very complicated dynamics that were the foundation of my relationship with my father. And the reason he was my best friend, however, was because, yes, he did whip me and he did think he was protecting me, but he also showed me a tremendous amount of love. He was omnipresent in my life. He ran so counter to the false narrative that Black men are not present in their sons and daughters' lives. I knew my father. I knew my great grandfather and my grandfather on the maternal side, and they all played huge roles in my life. And there was never a time, not one time, where I ever truly could say that they didn't love me. It was just that two things can be true at once, that we have to allow ourselves to look at situations in very complex ways and to gain that understanding, I think, which is missing in our culture today as Americans. There's just no allowance for complexity. Same thing with the country. I see a parallel between my relationship with my family and my relationship with my country. And I had to tell the truth of the story and to be honest about my family and my country as well in order to process a lot of the things that I dealt with as a kid. And I needed to understand why I was beaten with a belt, why it's wrong, but how that tied into the whipping that my ancestors endured during slavery. And I had to learn about those ancestors and really by the name and actually study their lives in order to understand why I was socialized the way that I was. My first instinct was to say no, that, Black men still very much struggle with talking about our trauma or mental health issues that are related to the experiences of growing up and the experiences that we've grown up in. But I'm going to push back on myself on that because when I really think about it, and this a lot of people can relate to, if you go all the way back to World War II, for instance, during World War II, we had people coming back in body bags, and we were trying our best to honor these men and women who did their best to try to free the world and to make the world a better place. But one of the things that we did was there was a national consciousness about not crying and not grieving, showing sadness and not talking about the deaths and this national stoicism. And I can remember the greatest generation, people who made such a profound impact on my life, my uncles who were World War II veterans, and how closed off they were about not only their experience in these wars, but also the experiences that they had in the cotton fields of Alabama and the way they were treated in Alabama. And the fact that they were not treated as poorly overseas as they were treated when they came back to the country. Those were things that I had to read books about. Those weren't things that I learned from them. And then my father's generation, the baby boomer generation, they were a little better than the greatest generation. While my father hid a lot towards the end, where when I started doing this work, he was extremely open, one of the most open people I've known in my life. Yes, it's better. We're starting to talk a lot about the way that history impacts us and mental health, and how critical it is for us to be not to look at mental health through the prism of like working out and going to the gym, of maintaining yourself, your mental and your physical well-being, in order to be strong for our community and for our families. And so it is a conversation that's happening in our community. And a lot of times you need a therapist to really be able to fully heal from that. I was born on August 28th, 16 years to the day that Emmett Till was killed. And so that was the environment that I was growing up in, and that was the consciousness that my family had as they raised me. Well, one of the great things about this story is it brings people into a narrative that isn't really shared a lot. I am a Black man. I am a heterosexual Black man who was raised primarily by Black men. My mother was in my life, and I had strong matriarchs in my life, but I was raised by my father primarily, and my grandfather and my great grandfather had roles in my life. And so this narrative of Black men is not necessarily that prevalent in literature. And so the story about my father teaching me to shine my shoes from a very young age, and being very, very hyper vigilant about making sure that my appearance was as strong as it could be, is a powerful one, because my grandfathers were the same way. And in many ways, this is, part of my brand as a person. Whenever I go somewhere, someone will say, "Oh my God, you're always so dressed impeccably." But it's not necessarily just because I'm that concerned about what people think, but it's more about the way that I was raised. And when I go back into the pictures from that I was able to get from family members from the 1900s, that's what I see. I see people who were very dignified and very elegant and very dressed to the nines. And I think that that was, in a way, a form of protest from my family, because I went back into the records and I saw that under the slave codes in certain states, there were actually laws that prohibited Black people from wearing a certain quality of clothing and cloth. And so you could get 39 to 100 lashes for dressing too well. And then there's also the social pressure in general, these stereotypes and these belief systems about our people. So later on, when I did the book, I was able to interview my father about his childhood. And he said, "You know what it was, son?" He said, "I had hand-me-down shoes from my brothers. And some of those shoes, they were not in great condition. I did my best to keep them up. But when I put myself in a position, when I got out of Alabama and moved north, that was the first thing that we did, was to make sure that our shoes were always new and that they were always polished, so much that they could sing." Later on in the book, my mom said, "Your dad has lots of shoes and ties, and it would be great if you could go in there and take some of them, and maybe you can wear them in your interviews and stuff." And so I went into my dad's closet, and I just saw rows and rows and rows of beautiful, beautifully shined shoes. And I think that that, in a way, was a reflection of the childhood trauma that he had gone through, but also, once again, the beautiful dignity that my father had. And so it's important to look at the hard aspects, but to also celebrate the beauty of coming out of the experience that my father had. There was never a time that he was a victim or took a victim mentality. He was victimized, but he was not a victim. He would never call himself a victim. He came into the world a man and he left the world a man. And that's what this book really tries to capture. And it was probably one of the hardest things to do as a writer, was to tell the truth about the brutality and the struggle and all of that, but also show how powerful my family really was, and that pressure that I felt to redeem the sacrifices of previous generations was omnipresent. I think it's important to point out that not all Black families had the experience that I had, but I know that there are many who did. If you come from a family that descended from slavery and Jim Crow in America, it affected everything, including our diet and our last names. I mean, there are so many things that still are there, whether people want to accept it or not, despite having all the trappings of the American dream. On New Year's Eve every year, my parents would prepare a dish called chitterlings, pork chitterlings. And chitlins, that's what some people call them in the Black community. Chitlins were thought of a Black food, a food that was part of our heritage. And every New Year's Eve, we ate these chitterlings because we felt that it was honoring our ancestors who were actually force fed these pig intestines by the enslaver family. Because they'd take the best part of the pig and they would give the scraps to the enslaved people. And so my family thought, wow, we're going to celebrate this and we're going to make ourselves eat this and think that it's part of our heritage. But it wasn't until I really went into the history and started studying where it came from. It didn't come from the African side of our experience. We did the plant food diet in West Africa. It came directly from the European side of the enslaver experience. But the key is that these families on both sides, white and Black, in the South, ate a very sugar heavy, high fat, high sugar, high carb diet. That was something I believe that fueled in me a sugar addiction. But the sugar addiction was also fueled by a lot of the stress that I was dealing with as a child. Sugar was an escape for me. Sugar was an escape for my father. And it wasn't until later on when I started to study adverse childhood experiences that I understood that people who endure adverse childhood experiences often soothe with any number of addictions. I came from a very Christian family, and my father and mother, they really tried their best to live righteous lives. And so it would have been unfathomable for them to turn to alcohol or to turn to drugs, or not that those people can't be righteous, but it was just for my family, it didn't fit the narrative of what they wanted to be in their minds of themselves. And so my father used food as his escape because that was something that was socially acceptable. And a lot of that is because of the trappings of the sugar and all of the diet and everything. A lot of this being the only thing that would put a smile on our face amid a lot of the different painful things that we went through. I think that the ultimate success for me is bringing people into this experience and this sliver of American life that has not been extensively written about. Once again, the reason I emphasize being a heterosexual Black male, I hope that's okay for me to mention that, is because that experience is not as prevalent and prominent in the literature that we see. And I think that I'm very honest in the book about different definitions or characterizations of Black maleness, from toxic masculinity to the struggle of our authenticity and what we're expected to be, up against the reality of who we really are in many ways. And I think that a successful book is going to be one in which people are able to do the hard, difficult reading that this book requires. They were able to come into a part of the American experience that is not written extensively about. And also, I think changing the perceptions of people about the effects of beating children. Corporal punishment is legal in 17 states in America at this point in schools. And right now, Black children are beaten at disproportionately higher rates, Hispanic students, and also students with special needs. But it affects all students of all races. And I would like to see more awareness built around what I talk about in the book is how the effects of corporal punishment and childhood trauma, even if people think they're helping their children, actually how the effects can hardwire people for anxiety and having that fight or flight system on an all-time high at all times as adults. I think that people who paddle their children, most of them are doing so because they believe that they're doing a good thing for their child and they all love their children. I think that this book will help people understand effects that they may not have taken into account when they're hitting their children. So I think one of the big successes for me in this book is to have as many people as possible read this book and feel like they have a better understanding of American history that was not taught and that cannot often be taught in a textbook. And also to reach people who may have gone through corporal punishment, people of all races who maybe had violent childhoods and feel guilty about not about talking about it and confronting it and calling it abuse. I want people who went through that to understand that being a victim of corporal punishment is not your fault. And it's not wrong for you to say that it was problematic. And it doesn't mean that your parents didn't love you. And it doesn't mean that you should be another generation to keep the secrets and to hold that in and to hold that burden. It's not your burden to carry. So to talk about it and can maybe even confront the people who did it to you and to explain to them that they owe you an apology or whatever necessary, that's a powerful thing. And I want people to feel able to give themselves permission to actually go and do whatever they need to do to deal with the hard parts of their childhood. And that's people of all races. This book is a universal book in that way. And I hope that at the end of the day, it's a good experience for people because it will make them that much better as people and also understand that we need to confront the dark parts of our history and of our families and of our upbringing in order to really come out the other side